Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the LaRouche Organization Friday Symposium. Today is January 31st. I'm Diane Sayre, and we'll be joined shortly by Bill Jones to discuss what will it really take to get to Mars. This is a really important topic, and I just want to take a step back because clearly we have a new president. President Donald Trump was sworn in just on January 20th. That's 11 days ago. And he has already completely turned over the chessboard, which is good. As I told some people, we were on a monorail straight to thermonuclear war. I think we're not on that same train at the moment, but where we're going is not that clear. So the LaRouche organization has been in a big fight on Capitol Hill to circulate a dossier on the Liars Bureau in defense of the Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel nominations. And I will say also, I think it's important for Robert Kennedy Jr. to be in this administration. He has had the courage to say that he believes the CIA was involved in the assassination of his uncle and his father. He is probably instrumental in as to why President Trump decided to release the files on the Kennedy assassinations and the King assassinations. And he has had some experience litigating against major multinational corporations and is not a fan of BlackRock. So these things are very important. Clearly, there's the battle royale, and I say royale literally because the British Empire, the British royals are completely freaked. The London Economist, London Guardian have spent many thousands of words attacking these nominees, as has the New York Times. We'll see where that goes. On some other matters, we have a problem. The power of the Zionist lobby, Miriam Adelson's $300 million, while it is very good, I don't think the genocide in Gaza would have halted one bit with Kamala Harris. So we have a pause, we have a ceasefire, we have some hostages being released at long last. But you have to ask, is there really an intention to clear Gaza and the West Bank for some crazy real estate scam? Is this Jared Kushner's get rich quick operation? What is this? And then you have the suspense of whether President Trump is going to successfully negotiate an end to what was seemingly the most direct path to thermonuclear war, which was the proxy war against Russia using Ukraine, where Ukraine has lost hundreds of thousands of young men, perhaps as many as 1 million. They are now literally kidnapping men to force them to serve on the front lines. This cannot go on. But what is going to be the basis for peace? Because if the United States thinks that we are the global hegemon and we can just threaten, if we think we're going to increase sanctions on Russia and that's going to work, it's not. And then you have also a policy related to the space program, which is that President Trump has talked about an iron dome, which some people are saying is the revival of quote unquote Star Wars. Well, Lyndon LaRouche's conception of the Strategic Defense Initiative was not a so-called iron dome, and it was not one-sided. It was intended to make nuclear weapons obsolete by allowing the United States and the Soviet Union to jointly develop a new technology which would make nuclear missiles obsolete because both sides would have the capacity to prevent nuclear missiles from striking. Unfortunately, I don't think that this is the policy of Trump. I think Elon Musk, frankly, would be very interested if he understood what LaRouche was getting at. He certainly has a love of scientific breakthroughs and scientific experiments. Now, we come to the question of Mars. Why is this important? Why is it a science driver? Why is it not about money? I heard a speech that Elon Musk gave in Guadalajara, which was fascinating because he really does have certain brilliant ideas. He really understands, it's in his gut, the necessity that man must be a spacefaring species. But then his approach to the development of the new technology is always put in monetarist terms. So I'm hoping that we can help the Trump administration to be successful in this regard by sharing Lyndon LaRouche's approach to science drivers and Mars colonization. And to do that, I've invited Bill Jones from EIR to be with me. He also is the husband of the late Marcia Freeman, who was an expert more than maybe anybody on the planet in terms of how we got to the moon and knowing some of the details of how this program worked. So, Bill, I'm really glad you can join us tonight, and I'll just turn it over to you. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Diane. I'm very happy to be here and get the invitation. As you mentioned, it's a very important time. Things are pretty chaotic. Like Trump has turned over the table, and we don't know exactly, where it's going to end up at. That's a certain moment of anxiety, but also a certain moment of hope, where possibly, a clear intervention on our part in some of these key questions that have been raised and intentions that have been declared by President Trump, or by people in his administration like Musk, that we could give it a clear direction. And of course, in terms of space exploration, whether it's back to the moon or on to Mars, is also always a question of the utmost rigor if it is going to be accomplished. And I'd like to take a look back, first of all, to see where we have come from. People, of course, remember, and I think even those who were not around at the time, they remember the space age, the Apollo program, with a tremendous amount of nostalgia, and see it as an important moment in American history, not only for Americans, but for the entire world. And there was, of course, the commitment of John Kennedy, and we have a picture here of Kennedy during giving the speech, I believe, at Rice University on space. And what people don't really understand, though, is that going to the moon and all these wonderful pictures that we had of the space program, that was meant just to be the beginning. We look back on it as really the sum of what was accomplished in space, but that was not the intention of John Kennedy. There was a whole program, nor was it the intention of NASA at the time that the space program was initiated by Kennedy in the 1960s. There was a whole array of developments that were to follow up the lunar landing, which would include a permanent stay on the moon, and would be followed up by a push to go on to Mars. Kennedy himself even said this at one of his last press conferences. He was asked about the work that was being done on nuclear energy, nuclear propulsion using nuclear energy, and he made the comment, says, "We're not going to need that for the moon. That will come at a later date when we have to go to Mars." And of course, he had been investigating. He had been at the NERVA Center, where they were doing the work on nuclear propulsion, and had met with people like Harry Finger and others who were involved in that, and knew exactly what they were going to do, what the program was going to be, and it was going to continue. That all ended, and it ended with the assassination of President Kennedy. People remember, of course, where they were when Kennedy was assassinated. I have a vague memory. I know I was in class, and it was announced that the president had been shot. I don't think they announced initially that he had been killed. They probably hadn't got the information, but at that point, class was let out. People had to go home. And it was just an understanding that everything you were doing, somehow you had to come to terms with this extremely dramatic event that had happened. And in many respects, the country was never the same after that. And following that, we of course had the long period of this war in the jungle, which should never have been fought, in which over 53,000 Americans were killed and over a million Americans served in, which led to a malaise among an entire generation as a result of these two events. And we still are really in the process of trying to recover from that. So in one sense, in looking at going back to the moon and going to Mars, is really reinitiating what should have been done in the 1970s, following the successful landing on the moon. And this was Kennedy's vision. He was able to accomplish this because he had a team of people who had been brought over here from Germany, who had been working on this for several decades. This was the group who had been involved in the Peenemunde program, which was really a group of young, as in many different countries, there were a lot of people at the beginning of the 20th century who were becoming excited about the possibility not only of airplanes and the like, but also of space travel. And in Germany, of course, these young amateur people who were involved in this had a certain technical expertise on how it could be accomplished. And by the 1920s, given the context of the Versailles Treaty, in which Germany could no longer be involved to any great extent in military production of hardware and artillery, they were looking for new physical principles, which would not be covered by the treaty. And therefore, these experiments that were being conducted really in places like outside a department store in Berlin became very important. It was taken over by the German army and was heavily financed. These were the people who during the war were supposed to develop what Hitler called the Wunderwaffen, which would be used in order to win the war. But the people who were involved in that had been those who were enthusiastic over space travel, and during the entire course of what they were doing under this military regime was to try and figure out how to develop rockets in which mankind could become a spacefaring species. And as a matter of fact, Wernher von Braun, who is a well-known name today, was brought in by the authorities on suspicion that he wasn't interested in developing a weapon, but he was more interested in space travel. And he was really in danger of being thrown into prison for that, as well as probably his whole team. He was able to avoid that, but the reality of the situation is that they were really intent on doing this. And at the point whenever this war would be over, they felt that there would be an opportunity to use what they had been dealing with in their own experiments in Peenemunde would have some success. These are the people who really sought out the Americans after the war, and they did find them, and they were brought to the United States, basically to do experimenting in the desert of Texas on these V-2 rockets they had developed during the war. And it wasn't until the United States decided that there would be a space program that they were brought into a situation where their ideas could then be realized. So the United States had kind of a unique situation of a group that had been involved in dealing with rocketry over a period of several decades, who knew the ins and outs of this and could immediately get to work in creating the infrastructure for doing what Kennedy said, sending a man to the moon and back. And the timeline, of course, was dictated really by Wernher von Braun, who told President Kennedy we could do it in 10 years. So he made what people thought was an outrageous comment that we will send a man to the moon and back by within the decade. But he had been given word that this could be accomplished, and in fact, it was. They weren't the only ones who were doing this. Of course, there were also German scientists who largely had been kidnapped in Germany by the Russians when they went in there, because they knew that this rocketry, which was well known also in the Soviet Union, that these were the people who were the experts and could provide the basis for the development in the Soviet Union as well. So they had their Germans and we had our Germans, and we're working on this. The Russians, however, were not interested so much in the moon. And of course, Kennedy made the proposal several times to Khrushchev that we should work together. He saw it as an important element in creating some kind of stability in what he thought was most important, creating stability in the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And they never really paid much attention to it because they weren't. It wasn't on their program to go to the moon. In fact, their program was to go to Mars. In 1959, that is 2 years after Sputnik, the Soviets had a program or a proposal for developing the technology which would allow them to go to Mars. But at the point that the United States talked about the moon, for political reasons, the Soviets had to reorient their program towards something with regard to the moon rather than to Mars, so that a lot of the stuff was put on ice. But that was the intention, because also there you had a young group of people from the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, who were interested in space travel and who were doing the same type of things that had been done in Germany, that were being done also here to some extent in the United States, and were interested in trying to develop the technology for space travel. But the idea was from the get-go, also in the U.S. program, to not only stop. For Kennedy as well, he talked about the great ocean of exploration. And that meant that we were dealing with what we called the final frontier. But this final frontier was in fact infinite, because their space is infinite. And going to the moon was just the beginning. And Mars would be the next stage, but it wasn't going to end there, because there was a commitment and an understanding that mankind, which had its home, or as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky said, its cradle here on the earth, obviously through the development of technology, could bring itself outside of this earth to other planets, to other places in space, and that was the purpose of mankind to do that. So you had this group of people from the Peenemunde group who created the basis for the lunar program, which was successful. Given the assassination of Kennedy and given the Vietnam War, Johnson was committed to one thing, to realize what Kennedy had committed itself to, but he had no idea of going any further. And so much of what had happened after that was an attempt to kind of keep alive the sparks of an interest in space. And it was always a fight. Look, even the original space program was attacked. It was attacked by the British, who had this idea that, okay, we want to have technological superiority in order to maintain our control, but we don't want to excite the population too much about scientific development, because you don't want an educated population, because they'll start getting their own ideas. And there was a great deal of concern that the mood in the United States after Sputnik, and with the commitment to go to the moon, that things would change, and that this sleeping giant of America would then begin to chart its own course independently of what the so-called powers that be were indicating. And you had that during the period, that very short period, from Sputnik until the death of Kennedy, where there was an intensive effort to emphasize science and technology in terms of the education, in terms of the youth. And I can remember, not being a science nerd myself, the atmosphere at that time was offering all kinds of opportunities of going and visiting places like McDonnell Douglas, or having lectures from people from the engineering sites in aerospace and other high-tech industries, coming to the schools and talking about what they were doing and trying to excite people in getting interested in science. And of course, much of that ended with the death of Kennedy, and really stagnated from the period in which the Apollo program was ended. And this is something that we've been fighting all along. In fact, the beginnings of our organization were really caused by the fact that there was this idea that mankind is a parasite, and that his activity, his scientific and technical activity, is destroying nature, is causing pollution, and doing all sorts of things, and therefore it should be limited. And this was being promoted by major institutions. It became a program within the US government at a certain point. The United Nations was taking that up. And it was the introduction of what was called malthusianism, which is the idea that the world is overpopulated, we have too many people, and we have to somehow go back to a more natural state in which the activity of mankind is significantly limited. And this was a fight that was
Bill,
conducted.
I want to say something at this point. I don't know if Dave can put us, but there we go. Yeah, because I was just reflecting as you were saying this in my own life. I lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1972, and that was the year of our last manned space flight. And William Harrison Schmitt, was going on this flight. He was from New Mexico. So we were really focused. I was 6 years old, but every kid in my class was obsessed with the space program. And we knew the order of the planets, we knew about the atmosphere, we knew part of the rocket had to drop off. If we got in trouble, it was because we were designing new spacecraft in the margins of our papers. Then, and my father, you think about all of these things. My father had been drafted, and although my family were Quakers, he did go to Vietnam, but he served in a medical capacity. We moved back to Maine, 1973, arrived in Maine, and then by the time I was 2 years old or 8 years old, what were they teaching in my classes? Lifeboat. We had to do an exercise where you said, we're on a boat, it has 26 people, but the lifeboats only can hold 14 of them. You have to choose who can get on the lifeboats. They were subjecting 8-year-olds to that. And then we watched all these horrible horror films about living in a greenhouse with evil people breaking the windows and destroying the environment. So I'm just thinking, in a span of 3 years, the shift from this incredible optimism about space, about science, to no, human beings are bad, you're polluting the earth, you're destroying the earth, there's too many, and only the right people should be allowed to live and other people are expendable. I mean, that's really incredible.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
this is actually still the world that we're still living in to some extent. I mean, the fact of what happened in the United States during the election was extremely important, because a lot of the reaction, and it's based on a lot of different issues that people are concerned about, but the reaction against this type of culture was quite endemic throughout this campaign. And I think it's important because people, I think, have shown through what they did in the election that they are tired of living in that kind of a world. Now, the question of what the world's going to be like is still a much open question, but it means that you have now a population which has simply decided that we can no longer go back to that type of cultural life that has been foisted upon us. And most people don't know, foisted upon us for about 40 years. And the work that we have done in this is extremely important. And it's interesting that there was an intersection between us and the group of Peenemunde because of the unity of purpose with regard to the reaction against the zero growth Malthusianism. And one of the people who was involved in this was a very dear friend to both Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, Krafft Ehricke. And I want to show you now a picture of Krafft during his heyday. And this is, a lot of people won't recognize either of those people, but one of them is Krafft, is to the left, I believe. You can't see the whole picture from here. And to the right is Walter Cronkite. Now, people my age, or people, he only died a few years ago, but Walter Cronkite was the voice of American television for about almost 20 years, from World War II going on until the 80s. And he was the guy. Lyndon Johnson said at a certain point, when Walter Cronkite, and of course these reporters had been covering the Vietnam War for a long time before they actually took a position on it. And that was the case with Walter Cronkite. But at a certain point, he actually said, this is a devastation. This is a war that cannot be won. And Lyndon Johnson said at that point, if Walter Cronkite says that, it's a reality. It's really all over. And of course, he was well known, but he's there with Krafft Ehricke. And Walter Cronkite loved Krafft Ehricke. I had a chance to speak to him before he passed away, and we talked about Krafft. And he was just so excited about he had him on his program many times. Every time Cronkite covered closely the space program, and he had Krafft on all the time. Krafft would go to the Congress. He would be giving testimony at hearings. People had forgotten that by the 1980s, but he was a well-known figure there. One of the most imaginative of all of the people who had been at Peenemunde. In fact, at Peenemunde, he was working on nuclear propulsion. This is before we had the atomic bomb. People knew about the atom, right? And he was a student of Werner Heisenberg. And he was assigned to do these studies. So he was on the advance programs of all of the Peenemunde things that they weren't going to be able to do for years. He was working on it. And of course, by the 1960s or 70s, he was an adamant foe of this Malthusianism. And he was largely working on his own, writing lectures and writing articles and attacking this whole Malthusianism. And he was kind of isolated as a result of that, because the mainstream was this Malthusianism. And he came in contact with us because he read Fusion magazine, which was going out by the late 1970s. Fusion magazine had almost 100,000 readers. We had something like 50,000 subscribers, but it went out to newsstands, and it was all over the place. And he saw an article there on nuclear propulsion, and he wrote a letter to the editors of Fusion, and he was a little upset, right? He said, look, I worked on this in the 1940s, and why could you? It was somebody else who had written, who we were talking about in the article. And so we developed this relationship. Okay, you should write something, for Fusion. So he became a very close contact, and we actually helped. And my wife was very close to Krafft, very close to his Krafft and his wife and his kids. And she went out to California to try and introduce him to our ideas, and we really helped to revive, his own reputation at a time when he had been very isolated. He met Lynn and he met Helga, and he was very excited about everything we were doing, not only in terms of the space and the fusion. We were, the strongest promoters. We were actually the ones, most people in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s who knew anything about fusion energy knew about it because they had met people who were selling Fusion magazine at the airports, right? I mean, that's what we did. And Krafft saw that, and he was very excited by that. And so that it became a very close relationship. And I think Lynn, who had a lot of contact with some of the most important scientific figures in the United States. People don't realize this because of all of the stuff that has been thrown against us over the years, and against Lynn in particular, that he was really talking on an equal basis with some of the most important nuclear and energy scientists in the United States. And the same goes with the relationship that he had with Krafft, who Krafft was always boiling over with new ideas and stuff. And so this was really something that was important for Lynn. And Krafft was very much influenced by him as well, and also by Helga. And the Schiller Institute, he loved the Schiller Institute. He was German, he loved Schiller. And so he had his heart was always in the right place. I'll just show you some of the stuff that he was doing. If we take the next photo here, this Krafft was also an artist, and he painted. This is one of his paintings. He did a lot of paintings of things that he wanted to develop. This was a freighter that would transport materials in space between Mars and the moon, or whatever, one of the ideas he had. And then there was a chart that he had. The next slide, I believe. This is actually the Saturn II, and I believe this is from Krafft's own archives, where he indicates exactly the various things that go on into the Saturn II, which is a part of what became the Saturn V rocket, which took a man to the moon. And then one further picture by Krafft that I'll show you towards the end of his life. We kind of reinstituted him into the space community by the 1980s, and this is, I think, from 1984, probably a year before he died. My wife had called the people in the space community and reintroduced them to Krafft Ehricke. A lot of them knew his name, but they didn't know who he was. It was a long time ago when he was on Walter Cronkite or talking to the Congress. And he was revived, and he came and gave his last lecture to the American Astronautical Association here in Washington. And you see the people here who he's talking with. I don't know who the two are, but the gentleman to the right up there is Fred. I'm trying to think, got his last name. Oh, Frank Winter, who was the controller of Wernher von Braun. Fred was a naval captain, and he was a very close friend to von Braun. But as he said, he told us later on, he was also assigned to keep an eye on von Braun for the intelligence community. So he was also at that. And this also created a situation in which Lynn began to focus more specifically on a lot of the ideas that Krafft had put forward. Krafft saw the mankind as an extraterrestrial being. That is, that man, like Tsiolkovsky before him, this is the cradle where man is born, but he's not to be limited to it. And so his ideas in space travels were very far-reaching. In terms of the moon, he wrote a book which is about 900 pages. It has never been published. It exists in the original German. Krafft wrote in English, but he also wrote in German a lot. And we have there is a copy of the what's called the Seventh Continent, which is a detailed description of how you would colonize the moon, how you would set up first an initial colony and then working towards creating a civilization on the moon. And the moon, of course, would be the takeoff point for going to Mars. I mean, the Russians thought they could go directly from here. Also, I think Elon Musk had an idea you would go directly from here. It's more difficult, but if we have the moon as a starting point, there are a variety of reasons why it's much easier to get to Mars from the moon, so that the colonization of the moon for Krafft was a way to move further into space. We also did a translation, at least the first 8 chapters of that book is also extant that Krafft wrote. And as a result of that, as a result of this dialogue between Lynn and Krafft, he came up with a lot of Lynn's own ideas on developing the space as an integral part of the development of mankind here on Earth. Because the importance for Lynn was, of course, that the mind of man is really the highest point of his development. That the importance of the human being is that he has a mind which can create new ideas, which can propel mankind forward, which can do good for many other people, and therefore developing the mind, creating the preconditions for education, for excitement in scientific ideas, for excitement in creating new ideas was absolutely essential in any kind of rational society. And he saw space travel as the notion of the colonization, the idea of the future of what has to be done in order to take mankind further than it has come at this point. Similar to what you had with the original exploration in the 15th, 16th centuries, that we sent out initially these 3 ships out to this unknown land to try and see what it was and what it was like, and to come back and report on it, and try moving from there into developing new places that had been really not totally untouched by mankind. Some were, like Antarctica and the Arctic, but others which were not touched by civilization in the same way. And that's what we take with us. We take with it our civilization to expand it as an extraterrestrial phenomena, as well as a phenomena here in the world. And Lynn had 1987. If you ever get onto YouTube and you go look for The Woman on Mars, the original Peenemunde people, those who were working in the 1920s in Germany trying to develop rockets, were excited by a film which was called The Woman on the Moon, which was done in the 1920s in Germany, and that's also available there. But what Lynn had done for the 1988 campaign was he felt that he must also instill a vision. This was towards the end of the Reagan administration, who had been very open to this notion of the SDI. It had been, obfuscated a lot by people in the administration. There was a lot of goings on to prevent it from being realized in the way that the LaRouche wanted it, as a unifying force between the Soviet Union then and the United States. But it was still a factor in our own activity. And so he did this video of the woman on Mars, trying to give people an idea of what things could have been if you were looking back in 2025 to what was going on in the 1980s, what could have been accomplished in that. And that's also available. And the idea there was very simple, and it built very much on this notion of Krafft and the notion of the colonization of other planets and other worlds. That if you see it in the sense of what we did, what the Columbus, what Toscanelli, what Nicholas of Cusa had in mind during the period of the Great Renaissance, that the world in Europe had a lot of problems. And the idea was that if we go and try and find other places we can create new culture, we can take the best of our cultures and have a new situation in which we can build up a new world, which will then have its effect on this old world. And they began with small interventions, and then Columbus went with his 3 ships, and more came, and civilization was transmitted all over the globe. And by the 16th, 17th century, mankind had reached all over the globe. If we look at the latest things in Antarctica and the Arctic, there was not a foot on the globe which had been untouched by human hands. And that's the idea that Lynn had in many of his documents during that period was working on, that this is what we have to look at. We have to see that we begin initially with initial phases. We got to go there to find out what it's like. We can initially set up small colonies to try and see what we have to do to make it habitable. And then at that point, we can also think in terms of actually creating a new civilization there. And this was, of course, the idea that Krafft had. Already in the I'm losing my thing here. Let's see. Already in the 1960s and early in the 1950s, both Krafft and von Braun had ideas about how to go to Mars, and they were different. Von Braun had this idea: you would take a flotilla of, I can't remember, it was 8 ships with 70 people, and you would go up into Mars. Krafft was critical of that. He says, first of all, it's too many people for an initial phase. And he said, you don't need, he made the comment, there was actually a letter writing between von Braun and Krafft on these issues, right? And Krafft said, look, you don't need, if you want a good navigator there, you have to have a navigator on board who knows something about the ship, knows something about, where he's navigating, but he doesn't have to be a PhD in astronomy. I mean, you don't need, you just need the people who are capable of doing the things. You can take like 8 people. You can have 3 ships. You can have one as the crew, most of the crew. You have a supply ship, and you have an energy ship, and you can take these up there, and you set up, a colony with the 8 people there, and go on from there. But you don't begin with this major, sending up a whole flotilla thing. Because if something happened, it can be a real tragedy, right? Because this is all of this is very chancy and risky. So you want to take it one step at a time. But he had that idea that the world that we know it, the final frontier, if you want to say it, we don't know what the final frontier is because we don't know what we're going to find out there. That's the crazy thing, right? We can't see it. Lynn also made this point himself, that to the extent that we do get out there, it's not simply that we are there, but we have adopted a vantage point in which we can figure out the new things that we don't know now. And that the development of science is essentially based on this notion that it's the unknown, or what Cusa called the learned ignorance. That the basis.
I wanted to bring something up here, because I think in his Science and Technology Needed to Colonize Mars, he talks about a few areas where you're going to have to get breakthroughs. One of which was, I think, optical biophysics. One was the development of new materials, new kinds of ceramics, new kinds of things that could withstand extreme temperatures, extreme conditions. I think another one was computers, which we've already gotten to be pretty, but maybe, I mean, he was there when a computer took up an entire house, so he could be watching that. And then also fuel, and I can't remember if there were some other areas, but I think, people tend to think of the space program as about something that you're doing out there, but the place where you're doing it is here, right? Because you have to make the discoveries. It's the human mind that has to make a leap in its understanding of the universe.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to insert that because you might
Yeah.
say more about that.
No, that's exactly the point. And the fact of the matter is that it's interesting. People are talking about AI. Somebody said that he who controls AI is going to control the world. I don't know who made the comment, or if it was Lynn who made it, but the idea was he who controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the world. Don't forget AI, right? And if you look at it now, look, I mean, the fact of the matter, all of these programs, even Krafft's program, he had an idea of having nuclear propulsion, which was important, because the question is the time frame. I mean, what they were looking at, both Krafft and von Braun at the time, in working out these programs, were working largely on the basis of the idea of chemical propulsion, which of course means that you're going to be there for like 3 years, right? It's going to take a whole 3 years to get all this stuff done. This is all changing now, right? I mean, look at this. What we're looking at with what the Russians did with the Oreshnik, right? And we don't know everything. We know essentially what they were doing, but it was this electromagnetic spectrum that they were working on. That it can be very, very quick. I mean, the idea is, and there are things that are people working on now. There's what's called the Vazmir's program that Franklin Chang Diaz is working on, which had to do with electromagnetic. It's a form of ion propulsion. And there was also another one called the muon drive, can't remember the name. Again, an ionic drive, which is being worked on. And these are guys working in a little, with a little budget, and then, certain things, and we don't know how successful they are. And then, of course, we know what the Russians are doing. We don't know everything that they're doing on this, but they're doing more on this because they have a commitment to do this, because with everything else that's going on, science and technology is the key for them to maintaining their own sovereignty, and they know it. And we aren't really at that point yet. I mean, we're saying a lot of things about what we're going to do, but the question is are we really rigorous about it? I mean, this is the thing that has to be, I think, introduced in a very big way with this administration, which is confused on economics and confused on a lot of other things that are going to be extremely important in that respect. But that's really what we're at. And we have a situation today where we're looking at going to Mars. We may have a capability which will get us there, much quicker than anybody ever thought. The problem we have today is that science is so divided because of the geopolitical problems that there's no way of really knowing what we are accomplishing. And we can't do it. I mean, somebody said today, now that the Chinese have come up with this AI, which is much more effective and much cheaper, they say we should get some of their people and bring them over. What are you going to do? Offering them money? I can't imagine these Chinese guys really being eager to go to the United States. They'd be ending up in jail.
Maybe we shouldn't have thrown all the Chinese American scientists out of the country to start with.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But if you could get some order in that to some extent, and we really look at what we're actually dealing with the orientation of actually becoming an extraterrestrial species, as Krafft and Lynn have indicated, we would have a tremendous future in front of us. And that's really that geopolitical problem which we have to deal with in order to accomplish this. But I think we have, the idea is, as you mentioned, that that science is always a work in progress. And Lynn, he mentioned that in the things that he was writing on the Mars. He said that the question of anomalies sometimes cause a little disturbance among this. That somebody was telling me that. I was talking to somebody who was talking about the discussions that Lynn had. And this was also an issue that they would talk about the anomalies, and he will get so upset. Why are you worried about anomalies? That's what's going to lead us forward, right? When we see the problems, when we see the new situations that we have not yet discovered, this gives us the capability of understanding more or better about what our world is like than anything that we have accumulated up until this point. And of course, going out into the universe, that is, we know what happened, like with the Webb telescope and all of these things, that we're seeing so many things that we didn't even know happened. We're finding new worlds all the time. Who knows what we're going to see from the moon, right? I mean, the Chinese want to have astronomy on the moon. I mean, and who knows what we're going to see from Mars. I mean, it's an open world in that sense. I mean, it is an infinite frontier that we're facing here. We just have to use our capabilities and our knowledge in order to create the kind of programs necessary for moving mankind forward. And it's in that way you're going to resolve, as was the case with the space program. It's in that way you're going to resolve the other immediate problems that we see around us: the homelessness, the poverty, the unemployment, and the desperation and the depression that people are in. This presents an issue of hope for them, but you have to look to the stars in order to resolve the problems here on Earth. I mean, that's always been the case.
Well, one other aspect of the space program I wanted to bring up was Lynn talked about how many people you had to have on Earth to support a small number of people, either in space, which we're not doing very well right now. Poor Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore have been stuck up there on the space station. I guess Trump is finally going to have Elon Musk bring them home. But I think being in 7 months with no gravity can be very harmful. I mean, it's really terrible. But if you think about NASA, I guess NASA employed 40,000 people, but there were 400,000 of people employed by companies that were feeding components into the space program. And then just if you look at a picture of mission control, I don't know how many people could fit in there. It looked like 150 or 200 people. And this is for 3 guys up there in space, right? It's a massive, massive support operation, which involves everybody in such a big way. And I think people also don't really understand that. And that's one of the unfortunate aspects of Musk, and now Jeff Bezos is launching satellites. Or space is not supposed to be the domain of a few billionaires to get their thrills. There's something much more fundamental about this. But go ahead.
Yeah, you cannot accomplish this idea unless there is a national commitment to do that. And I know there's a lot of this anti-government stuff, floating around even in the new administration, maybe even more so than earlier. And we had that commitment because the president had made the commitment himself, and that brought the country, to bear on that. And the most important element in that was the fact that we had NASA. This was the growth element in the U.S. economy. I mean, you can talk about all these computer companies and all of that came out of the space program. But the accomplishment of the space program could only have been done by that national commitment. We still have to, get to the point where there's a clear understanding of that, because there is a lot of this orientation. Well, there are two problems you have to deal with. One is the orientation for making it into a private enterprise issue, which will, get you a few things, but certainly won't get you into lunar colonization. The other thing is the notion of this space force, which has become, Eisenhower made the commitment at an early stage, and the Air Force was always interested in controlling space. In fact, there was a fight between the Army and the Air Force on who will really control the rocketry, right? Is it an artillery, or is it something else that has to do with the Air Force? And Eisenhower, understanding the military-industrial complex, made the decision that will be a civilian agency which will control the space program. And that's again what we need. That has been the saving grace up until this point. And every other country knows that too. The Chinese know that, the Russians know that, and nobody is going to go to this. And we only, when we get to the point, I mean, we're trying, to compete with them. The only we get to the point where we see that that's needed, will we at all be successful? And we won't be successful unless we learn to cooperate with them too, which is the other thing. I want to show a couple of other things before going. One is the Kepleropolis. That is, if you get an initial entity, a facility on the moon. You see that here. There's it became a painting. There was Krafft did a lot of his own painting, but he also had Chris Sloan, who was one of our people. It was a nice, very good artist. Do the artistic stuff on it. This is a sketch that obviously was worked on by Krafft, because he indicates, and I can't see where things are, but it indicates what these various entities, these various shells will do. And there's like an agriculture project. You're going to have to create an artificial environment. I mean, this has been a big thing over the years, is this terraforming Mars. There was a whole project on that in NASA, that, okay, you don't have the same kind of, black earth that you have, here, but you can do it artificially, because you're going to have food, and you're going to have to support a population. And that is the Kepleropolis, and one of the ideas that Krafft had for the initial phases. And I want to show you this last piece of it, because Krafft died in, it was 84, and he had leukemia. He was very young. He was in his 60s. And both he and von Braun died very young. I don't know if, doing a lot of rocketry most of their life maybe had an effect on him, but he was very young at that point, and we had a big memorial in there, and Lynn, of course, was there, and Helga was there, and we had some of the people from Peenemunde also to talk about Krafft and his work. It was very important for him. And then just the last picture I want to show you, for those who are interested in more about the Peenemunde crowd, you read How We Got to the Moon by Marcia Freeman. This is such a wonderful book. I lived with her for almost 30 years, and this was really a treasure. I mean, the couldn't have been happier in this. A person, and I was reading her book. I was reading this book the other night. I was in the library. I was going to give a talk on China, and I read the first few pages about Hermann Oberth and the things that he did as a young teenager, and trying to figure out, what if we could get, if we could actually send a rocket to the moon. He was doing it in the swimming pool, making all these, and it's just so much knowledge, because she had, she talked with Oberth's daughter and all of the people she knew. I mean, it's just a wonderful source of history that I would recommend everybody. You look on Amazon, you can probably get it for $10 or something like this nowadays. But it was
really more than that. I bought it recently.
It's going up but it's really well worth the while. And I think that's the perspective we have to have. We have to get it into this administration. People, there's so many crazy ideas, along with some good intentions, but we really have to bring a certain amount of rigor and rationale to what they're trying to accomplish.
Well, thank you. We're going to do more on this topic. I think it's really important. I think I would like to really work through that paper, The Science and Technology Needed to Colonize Mars, because Lynn asserts there, among other things, that if you had a 40-year project, and I don't know how long it would take at this point, maybe 25 years or 30 years, I don't know. But he said one of the things that would happen is the purchasing power of the average household would increase by an order of magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine if you could pay for 10 times more groceries. That might be what you used to be able to buy 5 years,
Yeah, if you could buy eggs for $2 again.
Right. No, exactly. So it will have a real measurable benefit on your immediate standard of living, mental health, because there's something to be optimistic about. It's okay to realize you don't know everything, and that there is a standard of truth, because nowadays everything's arbitrary. Whoever has the most money determines the narrative. We don't even have it's not even truth anymore, it's narrative. That is the most bizarre. I think every true scientist is like rolling over in their grave over the very thought of having a narrative as opposed to truth, or a closer approximation of truth, which is empirically measurable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, and there are people there. I mean, it's also a question of outreach to people who understand what's going on at this point. I mean, you've got a situation which people understand that, okay, we we don't accept the way the things were, and we want something new. And these are the people who we have to reach to give them an idea of what the potential is. Because they're watching television or watching the daily press briefing. You're not going to find that out, right? And it's got to be realized, and we really have to do it. And I think the forces are there if we can just find them and get them into motion.
Yes.
At both, politically and in the science community as well. I mean, there got to be people who understand reality.
Right. Yes, that's the idea. So I'd like to thank you very much. I think our time is running up. But thank you, everyone who's watching. Please go to the LaRouche organization, sign up to volunteer and donate. And if you do a monthly recurring donation of $10 or more, you will get LaRouche's Daily Intelligence, the EIR Daily Alert, and the weekly publication Executive Intelligence Review. So thanks very much. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week. Who knows where we'll be by that time.
Okay. Bye-bye.